Welcome to episode 208 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the most complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we walk you through the Epicurean texts, and we discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. This week we're continuing in Book 2 of Cicero's On Ends, and we're starting approximately around section 18, which is page 54 of the Reid Edition. But before we jump back into the details, let's talk about generally where we are in the discussion. Cicero has chosen the topic of justice and injustice in general as a way of hammering Torquatus with the idea that Epicurus's morality is inferior to the Platonic or the Stoic type of morality that's based on virtue. Cicero's generally been dealing with Epicurean ethics and attacking Torquatus's position, saying that punishment is not a sufficient basis for motivating people to do right, that they need to be grounding their actions on ideas of virtue, if not ideas of punishment by a supernatural God, at least an idea that there is a absolute morality, absolute virtue that is independent of pleasure, that you don't do for the sake of pleasure, but because it is perhaps beautiful or just because it's the right thing to do. The examples that Cicero gave last week were of people who did bad things and were concerned about being discovered. And Cicero was arguing that this concern about being discovered is not a sufficient means of restraining people from doing bad things, because that's obviously not working. The examples that he gave of an executor of an estate who failed to transfer it to the daughter of the dead person as he had promised the dead person that he would do, or the example of Quintus Pompeius, who disowned a treaty with another country that Rome had made a treaty with. Those people were willing to do what they did despite the fear of punishment. And today, Cicero is going to up the ante by saying that not only does the fear of punishment not restrain people, but there are people who don't even fear punishment, in the sense that they know that they are basically all powerful. He gives the example of Marcus Crassus, who, if I remember correctly, my Roman history, was reputed to be the richest person in the Roman world. And in addition to being rich, he was a famous general and so forth who met his end in a very unhappy way. But the example for purposes of our discussion is that Marcus Crassus was so rich and so powerful that he felt no obligation whatsoever to restrain his conduct based on it being discovered if he did something wrong, because he had the power to pursue his interest regardless of whether he were discovered or not. Now, before we go further into Cicero's examples, another aspect of the general situation is this. We had a post on the forum just recently about the idea that Stoic or Platonic morality is just better than Epicurean morality, because you can list out all these things that Platonic morality, in terms of being beneficent or friendly to everyone in humanity, as opposed to just those who are your personal friends. And in other aspects of virtue, that an absolute type of virtue is better than Epicurean virtue. And it's important to remember, Epicurean philosophy is based on an understanding of the universe in which there is no supernatural God that's enforcing an absolute morality, and that there are no ideal forms in a Platonic sense in some other dimension that serve as an absolute guide to conduct. And so the important issue is not where we want to end up, because most people do agree that certain things are better than others. Certain things are more desirable than others, at least from the way they see them. The question is not so much the ultimate destination of a society that we would like to live in. The question is really more the foundation for getting there, and whether you can get to a desired destination based on a fantasy of noble lies, Plato might say, lies that people are told that's not true, or whether we can get to our destination based on what we think is true about reality. And that's what Epicurus is doing in basing his morality on pleasure and pain, the faculties given by nature that we do know that we have, that we can feel for ourselves, as opposed to a fantasy of noble lies that's not true.
What I would say, Cassius, in response to what I'm reading here in Cicero is He's previously made the argument that the Epicurean approach to staying out of politics, to the extent that that's what Epicurus even said, he says in this book and elsewhere that he finds the Epicurean approach to the political sphere, the advice to stay out of partisan politics, to be troubling. He seems to want the Epicureans to engage in politics as if it would be better for their hometown if they did, as if it would be better for the Republic if they did. And now we find him in this book assigning every bad thing that any politician or political figure or general has ever done and laying it all at the feet of Epicurus. Obviously, what Cicero wants is for the Epicureans to engage in politics and put aside the pursuit of pleasure and take up the pursuit of virtue. And what I would just reiterate is Epicurus doesn't have the power to bring justice to all of these individual figures. And for Cicero to say that, Crassus was all powerful and functionally infinitely wealthy, and so when he went wrong, he went very wrong, and it was very difficult to stop him. Well, what do you want Epicurus to do in this situation? What do you want the Epicureans to do about this other than to throw off the pursuit of pleasure? Because in one or more cases, the pursuit of pleasure has led people down the wrong path. And again, I make the other point, which is that it's equally true that the pursuit of virtue, or at least the cloak of virtue, has covered a lot of very wrong actions on behalf of very powerful people. And I would, in that case, point to the letter that was written by Lucian of Samosata to his Epicurean friend Celsus on Alexander the Oraclemonger. This was a religious figure, a prophet of the god Glaucon. And what Lucian says in that text is that this was no common robber. The scene of his depredations was, in effect, the whole Roman Empire. That even the emperor himself, Marcus Aurelius, had consulted this alleged oracle on the eve of a great battle, and the oracle had promised a great victory, and when the victory that was promised did not happen, he said, well, I promised a great victory, but I didn't say which side it would come to. So he wraps himself in this cloak of sort of a divine figure, a virtuous oracle conveying the word of God to the multitude, but he was a shameless charlatan. I'm sure that Cicero, if he heard that story, would say, well, that's got nothing to do with me. And my response to the story about the guy who kept for himself the inheritance that was supposed to go to the daughter, the story of Crassus that he's going into here, this has nothing to do with me. It's got nothing to do with Epicurus at all. And again, I can reiterate this also. Cicero is really, really pushing this claim that Epicurus made, that the prick of the conscience or the fear of punishment would deter wrongdoing, but he's leaving out all of the rest of Epicurus on justice. And I really do think at some point, maybe at the end of this text, we're going to have to go through those principal doctrines on justice and give a better appraisal of what Epicurean justice really means, because Cicero is doing an absolutely terrible job of it.
Yeah, Joshua, I agree with you. Cicero's whole argument here has to be seen as a sort of misdirection in the way that you've just said it. He's trying to hold Epicurean philosophy responsible for people who are doing bad things and saying that, well, they're acting in their own interest and so therefore they're following Epicurean philosophy. Well, Epicurus didn't say to just think about your immediate interest. Epicurus said to think about all of the results of your actions. And in every one of these cases, we can argue that if they had thought about all of the implications of what they were doing, they would not have acted in the way that they did. So, number one of your points, it's unfair for Cicero to be blaming the actions of bad people on Epicurean philosophy. And again, there's a subtext of all this. Torquatus and Cicero are generally in agreement about when people are doing the right thing versus when they're doing the wrong thing. There's no difference in that end result about it would be better if, in fact, the executor had turned over the estate to the daughter as he was supposed to do. Both Torquatus and Cicero would likely have agreed that it would be better if Quintus Pompeius had not disowned the treaty that had been reached between the two countries. In every one of these examples, Torquatus and Cicero agree on the better result. The result that would be better for these people to pursue is not what is in dispute. What is in dispute is the rationale and the motivation that gets people to that right result. Cicero's arguing that we should look to some abstraction known as virtue as the motivating factor, And Torquatus is arguing that we don't look to virtue, we look to the results, which means the results in terms of pleasure and pain. So Cicero is laying out these high-sounding results and implying that only his philosophy will get you there. Torquatus is saying, no, Cicero, your philosophy is based on things that don't exist. I can get us to the right result based on things that do exist through nature, through the feelings of pleasure and pain. In all of this, the subtext underneath the conversation is almost as interesting as exactly what's being said on the surface. I think we can deduce from this something important about Epicurean philosophy. If you're expecting a society to function because bad people will be punished for their actions, then that means that Epicurus and Epicureans would be involved in the operation of that society. As you said earlier in the conversation, Joshua, Cicero seems to be complaining that Epicureans don't get involved in society. But the truth is, an Epicurean society will not work unless Epicureans are engaged with each other. Because if you don't have this punishment going on for bad actions, then people will do things that are detrimental to the rest of the community. In the great conflict that's going on as this book is being written with Cicero and Cassius and Julius Caesar, Cicero is not the one who takes action. It is the Epicurean Cassius who gets involved with Brutus, and they take the action that Cicero wants to see to restrain Julius Caesar from becoming a king.
Around the line 58 mark here on page 54, Cicero starts this way. He says, if a friend of yours on his deathbed asks you to hand over his property to his daughter and does not record the fact anywhere, as Spadius did, nor mention it to anyone, what will you do? You personally, Torquatus, would hand it over. Possibly Epicurus himself would. So as you assuredly would have acted in the same way, I put the question to you whether you do not see how the power of nature is exalted by the fact that you who determine all your actions by your own convenience and your own pleasure, as you yourselves declare, do in spite of that so act as to make it plain that you are guided not by pleasure, but by duty, and that natural uprightness has more influence with you than your perverted philosophy. If, says Carneades, you know that a snake is concealed somewhere, and that someone by whose death you will gain is intending to sit down on it unawares, you will do a rascally action if you do not warn him not to sit down. But still you would not be punished, for who could prove that you knew? So that's the challenge that Cicero makes to Torquatus here. He's saying that you say that you act in all things in the pursuit of pleasure as your goal, as your highest good. But I judge from your actions, Torquatus. I, Cicero, judge from your actions that it is virtue that guides you and not pleasure. It is duty that guides you and not convenience or self-interest. That's the challenge that he makes to not just Torquatus, but to the Epicureans in general. That all of this talk about pleasure and convenience and self-interest and self-sufficiency and all the rest is a smokescreen to conceal a niggling little interest in pursuing pleasure that was really there the whole time.
I'd really like to highlight that. At the very bottom of page 54, you can dissect Cicero's argument by focusing in on this line where Cicero says, talking to Torquatus, you who determine all your actions by your own convenience and your own pleasure as you yourselves declare, do in spite of that act as to make it plain that you are guided not by pleasure but by duty. Well, you can't let that sentence go unanswered. That is a very direct challenge, and it would be thrown back in Cicero's face by Torquatus in this way. I am being guided by pleasure in doing the things that I see to be right, Cicero. It's not duty that calls me to do it. It is pleasure widely and properly understood as all of the consequences of my actions. Pleasure not only of the stimulations of the moment, but also mental and bodily pleasures that ripple through the remainder of my life. It is a global assessment of my life that leads me to make this decision to do these things that we both agree are the right things to do. And so when you say it's duty, Cicero, you're just absolutely lying through your teeth. It's not duty. You're misrepresenting my position. I've never ever would look to some abstraction of duty to a God or duty to some absolute right and wrong. I am looking to the full consequences of pleasure and pain in my life as the way I make my decisions. So you can say that I'm acting according to duty as many times as you want to. You've been doing it paragraph after paragraph. You're going to continue for paragraph after paragraph. You've taken my ancestors in vain already. You're going to switch back and start talking about my ancestors again in just a few minutes. But I'm never going to admit to you that it is duty or virtue that is the motivation for what I'm doing or what my ancestors did. I'm going to always insist that it is the feelings of pleasure and pain given by nature that ultimately were the basis for these decisions. And I am totally ready to defend my conclusions and my actions till the end of time. I'm not going to give in to your illusions that they're less than noble just because I'm not bowing down to your God or your Platonic virtues. I'm looking to the reality of pleasure and pain as the basis for my decisions. And you can call my philosophy perverted as many times as you'd like, and that natural uprightness should have more influence with us than our perverted philosophy. But we prefer to go with a true philosophy as opposed to your made-up fictional philosophy.
Yeah, Cassius, on that point, let me read this from DeWitt's book, Epicurus and His Philosophy. He says, Epicureanism presented two fronts to the world, the one as repellent as the other was attractive. Its discouragement of the political career was repellent to the ambitious, its denial of divine providence to pious orthodoxy, and its hedonism to timorous respectability. Its candor, charity, courtesy, and friendliness were attractive to multitudes of the honest and unambitious folk. The influence of Epicureanism, though anonymous, has been persistent in literature, ethics, and politics. In literature and ethics, it has survived by amalgamation with Stoicism, chiefly through Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. In politics, it fathered the doctrine that the least government is the best government, which was espoused by John Locke and popularized in North America by Thomas Jefferson. All these aspects of influence have been overlooked because of the usual anonymity. It was the fate of Epicurus to be named if condemned, unnamed if approved. And Cicero here in this book has already started us on that project. He's already started us on the project of saying, you say that you're acting in the name of pleasure, but it is really virtue that drives you. It is really your understanding of your duty to the Roman people that drives you. And so he's effectively here taking Torquatus's Epicureanism and driving it deeper into anonymity so that virtue and duty can claim the palm in all of Torquatus's actions, and that pleasure will have nothing to do with it. And Torquatus himself, of course, has no patience for this.
Yes, that's right. And going back to the example of the person who is about to sit on the snake and whether you warn him or not, Cicero's claiming that the Epicurean would not tell the person about the snake and that he'd have no reason to because the only consideration he had was that he wouldn't be punished. And so therefore there would be no reason whatsoever for the Epicurean to tell someone who's not his friend that he's about to sit down on a deadly snake. Well, again, the same response. There's more at stake than the gain to be gotten from this one incident in the short term. If you did tell the person that they're about to sit down on the snake, they would be appreciative of your having done so. If that then added to your reputation for honesty and benevolence towards other people, then there are all sorts of other ramifications that you would benefit from in having revealed the existence of the snake. So in most every case, it seems that Cicero is narrowing the scope of vision so that it is only the immediate stimulative pleasure or pain you get from an action that is to be considered. When the truth is, it's all of the ramifications, all of the results that are going to come from the action that have to be considered. And if you look at all of the ramifications, all of the results, you can see that pleasure is enhanced by these decisions that for the moment may be painful or less pleasurable than they could have been. My God, how many times, Cicero, do you have to ignore where Epicurus has said in his letter to Menicius that you're sometimes going to accept pain in order to have greater pleasure or lesser pain down the road? Torquatus has reminded you of it just in the prior book. You're just choosing to ignore the argument that answers all of these questions. And, before we go past the snake issue, I remember in reading Cicero's On Duties, there's another example similar to this that's used. A trading ship is about to arrive in a port where there's been a famine, and the trading ship is loaded with grain. And he's about to come to the port, and his grain is going to be demanded at a very high price, and he's going to profit a lot from these transactions. The dilemma that's presented in the example is that the captain of the trading ship also knows that there are other ships loaded with grain coming to the same port a day behind him. What does the captain of the first trading ship to arrive at the port say to the people at the port? Does he tell them that, as happy as you are to receive my grain, I've got better news for you? There's 3 other ships that are going to be docking tomorrow, and there's going to be plenty of grain to go around for everybody. So there's no reason for you to pay an exorbitant price for my grain. I'll charge you a fair price for my grain, but also you'll be able to buy more grain in the near future. Does the trading captain tell the people at the port that? And in Cicero's On Duties, he suggests that the answer is that the captain of the trading ship would tell the people at the port so that they would not pay him an exorbitant price. But in that example, as well as sitting on the snake, you can analyze the result by saying that the captain of the trading ship who arrives first, if he does tell the people at the port that there's more grain on the way, his reputation for fairness will be enhanced. And in the future, he will reap benefits from that, probably by being a more desired trading partner in future transactions. So it's, again, the example of looking to all of the ramifications of your actions rather than just looking at the immediate short-term benefit. That is the way to answer Cicero's objections here.
Let me give you a modern example, Cassius, of this kind of thing. If you go to the city of Boston around Christmas time, you will find a very excellent Christmas tree. And every year since 1971, this Christmas tree has traveled by truck from Nova Scotia to Massachusetts, and it is sent there in thanks for the help that was given by the people of Boston to the people of Nova Scotia after the explosion on December 6th of 1917 of a French cargo ship called the SS Mont Blanc. It was one of the largest pre-nuclear explosions ever to have happened by man-made means. And so the people of Boston, who were close enough to send aid and send people to help, established a friendship between these two cities that continues to this day. And you wouldn't say that, well, for the inhabitants of Boston, there's no pleasure to be gained from sending aid to Nova Scotia. Of course there's pleasure to be gained from sending aid to Nova Scotia. Not only are you the kind of the hero of the day, but also it establishes connections and links that carry on through time. I mean, the ramifications of this event and its aftermath has really marked the relationship between these two cities ever since. And so to say that there's no pleasure at all to be gained in that is absolutely wrong-headed. But of course, for Cicero, he's thinking only in terms of pleasures that are caused by sensory stimulation. He can't wrap his brain around this other kind, this broader sense of the word pleasure to take into account everything else that surrounds it. And so he wouldn't look at this as an example of acting in the desire for pleasure. He would look at this as duty and virtue and give the palm to those in the contest. That's just one example. You could cite many, many more examples, but Cicero wants it to be very clear that when people act decently, it is only because they are acting in the name of duty. Or when people act decently, it is only because they are acting in the name of virtue. And that's just obviously not true. People can act decently in the name of gaining money for themselves. People can act decently in the name of their reputation. People can act decently for all kinds of reasons, a lot of which have to do with personal pleasure, and most of which bring personal pleasure in their train. I mean, it couldn't be more obvious to me.
Right. That is the ultimate point. Cicero's trying to say that you cannot be a good person unless you fly under the flag of virtue and claim that virtue and piety are your motivating factors. If you try to cite anything other than virtue as your motivating force, then you're bound to be a bad person. So as we wrap up section 18, Cicero has a closing sentence here that I'm going to read from the Rackham edition first, and we can talk about it because it pretty well summarizes what we've been discussing. Quote, "It is obvious that if fair dealing, honesty, and justice have not their source in nature, and if all these things are only valuable for their utility, then no good man can anywhere be found." So Cicero is insisting that if we don't put fair dealing, honesty, and justice directly in nature, and if we only look to their value in terms of pleasure or utility, then no good man will anywhere be found. He's insisting that fair dealing, honesty, and justice are abstract concepts that exist for their own sake, and that you're not interested in the utility that comes from them. And if utility is your only test of whether you're going to do something or not, then you're never going to be fair dealing, honest, or just.
Yeah. And any clear thinker would just rip this argument up one side and down the other. Cicero wants this to be a binary choice. You can either act out of self-interest or you can act virtuously. You cannot act both virtuously and out of self-interest. This is so clearly false. If you pass a law, for example, let's say you are a consul of Rome and you pass a law and the law adds something to the betterment of society. Well, you live in that society. So not only are you doing something good for the Roman people, but you're also doing something good for yourself because you're part of the Roman people. You could pile example on example here, but it couldn't be more clear to me that Cicero's rigid approach to all of this does not allow for any of the nuance that is required to really understand this. And it's funny because Cicero just said in the preceding paragraph that, Torquatus, you say that you're acting in the name of pleasure, but really you're motivated by virtue and a sense of duty. And that perhaps even Epicurus himself, though he is a hedonist philosopher who claims he is motivated by the pursuit of pleasure, perhaps Epicurus is actually motivated by a desire for virtue and a sense of duty. But does Cicero not see how easy it is to flip the table on that and say, Cicero, you say that you are motivated by virtue and duty, but you are actually motivated in all of your actions by pleasure. I realize that at the bottom of this page, we're going to get to Torquatus's ancestors, which, if people remember our discussion of Book 1 from a year and a half ago or whenever that was, Torquatus made the claim that his illustrious ancestors acted in the name of pleasure and self-interest, even while they were helping the Roman people. And you can make the exact same argument about Cicero. But Cicero is a very prickly person when it comes to his reputation. He does not want the pursuit of pleasure imputed to him. And the question is, why, Cicero, do you have so many houses and villas? Why do you have houses in the city and in the country? Why do you have fine statuary and gardens? Why do you have all of this worldly wealth if your only goal is to pursue virtue and duty? Wouldn't it be easier to pursue virtue and duty if you were less encumbered? But no, obviously, he has these places as places to resort to for pleasure and leisure and recreation when he wants to get away from the city. That's in his free time. He's pursuing pleasure, obviously. But it's equally true that he's pursuing pleasure in his political work, in his work as a lawyer. All of it is done out of essentially self-interest.
Yeah, Joshua, that's the continuing question. Cicero refuses to see Torquatus's side of things. He insists that Epicurus is depraved, or perverted is the word we use today. And he's never going to come to any kind of agreement with Epicurean reasoning because he insists that you cannot be a good person unless you hold virtue to be the supreme good. Now, we've gone through this question again today. We're going to continue for the next several weeks and through the end of Book 2 with basically that same issue. Rather than start on section 19, though, we're going to come back to that next week. Since this is our last episode for 2023, a couple of things that we ought to talk about before we close. First of all, I want to thank our podcasters, Joshua Calasini, Martin, Don, who's been with us many times this past year, and hopefully will come back next year. But as we come to the end of the year, it's a good time to review some of the more foundational issues that we talk about, and we can focus on this very question we're dealing with today. Why is it that people are so resistant to seeing pleasure as the supreme good? Over the past year, one of the more important points we've been stressing is how it is essential in these conversations to remind people that Epicurus's definition of the word pleasure is much more broad than sensory stimulation. When you add to sensory stimulation the observation that if you're not in pain, you are experiencing pleasure, then you see that Epicurus's definition is much wider and includes all these other activities of life that Cicero thinks must be described as virtue and can't have anything to do with pleasure. That widening of the scope of the definition of the word pleasure enables a persuasive response to be given to these arguments. And of course, that's why Cicero has rejected Epicurus's definition, because he knows that if it is accepted, then his argument are seen to be invalid.
What's so important is considering long-term outcomes. If you're only focused on the present, you're going to make certain kinds of decisions. But if you're focused on the long-term outcome, you're going to make better decisions. And perhaps if we think of pleasure only as what's the easiest right now, then that also could be why pleasure gets kind of a bad name, because then bad choices are made.
Yes, Calasini. Now, of course, as we discussed long-term versus short-term, it's not solely a matter of time. As Epicurus has told us in the letter to Menoetius, the wise man at the banquet is not going to choose the most food, but the best. So it's not solely a matter of length of time, but the analogy holds true in the sense of all of the ramifications versus only a few of the ramifications. A few of them that you see right now does not take into account all of the ramifications that you're going to see either over time or if you just simply take a step back and look at the bigger picture. That's the analogy. It's not necessarily just continuing over a number of years. It's a question of stepping back and looking at a broader picture of everything. And when you talk about the narrower versus the wider view, you're not using a time analogy. You're talking about more of the full consequences, the full context of the situation. You don't just look at a small slice of the results that will occur from your actions. You look at all of the results. Time is certainly a part of that, but it's not the only part. There may be ramifications that occur very quickly that will be mental as opposed to physical, or some other part of your body or some other aspect of intensity is involved. As Principal Doctrine 9 talks about the ways of looking at pleasure in terms of duration, part of the body, and intensity. You've got those three aspects to consider, and of those three, duration, a reference to time, is only one of the three. And you have to consider all of these things in assessing any action.
As I consider the arguments that Cicero is putting forward here, I'm thinking of two things. And one of those is an epic poem by Dante called The Inferno, in which Virgil is the poet's guide to the underworld. And in the sixth circle of hell, the circle of heresy, they encounter the Epicureans unconscious, laying in lidless coffins. And they are informed that on the day of judgment, the lids of the coffins will close over them and they will wake up forever locked in these dark coffins. And their punishment is fitting because of the crime, and the crime is their denial of the afterlife, of life beyond the grave. It occurred to me as I think about this that there is another source that imagines Epicurus in the afterlife. And that source is one that I've already quoted from today. It is this letter that was written by Lucian of Samosata to his Epicurean friend Celsus, and it's called Alexander the Oracle Monger. And here's what Lucian of Samosata has to say. He says, "A time came when a number of sensible people began to shake off their intoxication and combine against him, chief among them the numerous Epicureans. In the cities, the imposture, with all its theatrical accessories, began to be seen through. It was now that he, this religious charlatan figure, the oracle, it was now that he resorted to a measure of intimidation. He proclaimed that Pontus was overrun with atheists and Christians who presumed to spread the most scandalous reports concerning him. He exhorted Pontus, as it valued the God's favor, to stone these men, Touching Epicurus, he gave the following response. An inquirer had asked how Epicurus fared in Hades, and was told, of slime is his bed and his fetters of lead. The prosperity of the oracle is perhaps not so wonderful when one learns what sensible, intelligent questions were in fashion with its votaries. Well, it was war to the knife between him and Epicurus, and no wonder. What fitter enemy for a charlatan who patronized miracles and hated truth than the thinker who had grasped the nature of things and was in solitary possession of that truth? As for the Platonists, the Stoics, the Pythagoreans, they were his good friends. He had no quarrel with them, but the unmitigated Epicurus, as he used to call him, could not but be hateful to him, treating all such pretensions as absurd and puerile. Alexander consequently loathed Amastris beyond all the cities of Pontus, knowing what a number of Lepidus's friends and others like-minded it contained. He would not give oracles to Amastrians because of the Epicureans that were present there. And in the end of this letter, Lucian writes as follows. He says, "My object, dear friend, in making this small selection from a great mass of material has been twofold. First, I was willing to oblige a friend and comrade who is for me the pattern of wisdom, sincerity, good humor, justice, tranquility, and geniality. But secondly, I was still more concerned, a preference which you will be very far from resenting, to strike a blow for Epicurus, that great man whose holiness and divinity of nature were not shams, who alone had and imparted true insight into the good, and who brought deliverance to all that consorted with him." So the takeaway from this text, Cicero has been laying all of these charges at the feet of Epicurus, but what we have here is a concrete example of a criminal preying on the Roman Empire, and the only people who were standing up to him were the Epicureans. All of the other schools of philosophy, all of the various classes and conditions, the nobility, the aristocracy, the equestrians, the plebeians, everybody was going to this guy as if he had a semblance of the truth. But what Lucian is getting at here in this letter is that it was not this charlatan, this mountebank, this thug who had grasped the truth. It was Epicurus who had grasped the truth. And if I can quote now from Henry David Thoreau in his conclusion to his book, Walden, he says, "No face which we can give to a matter will stead us so well at last as the truth. This alone wears well. For the most part, we are not where we are, but in a false position. Through an infinity of our natures, we suppose the case and put ourselves into it, and hence are in two cases at the same time, and it is doubly difficult to get out. In sane moments, we regard only the facts, the case that is. Say what you have to say, not what you ought. Any truth is better than make-believe." That's kind of my answer to Cicero in everything he's been saying here. Any truth is better than make-believe. You claim, Cicero, that virtue is your guide, that virtue is founded in nature, that nature tells you to pursue virtue, but I tell you, Cicero, that is a lie. And any truth is better than make-believe. You say, Cicero, in one of your other works, that you are comforted by the belief that the soul does not die with the body, and that you would not have this belief ripped from you while you were still alive. But the belief that the soul survives after the death of the body is a lie, and any truth is better than make-believe. And I could go on and on and on about this, but it helps to put this in proper perspective here. It helps to cite an example where it was really only the Epicureans among the ancient pagans who were willing to look at this most cruel and unjust person and to attempt to bring him low. And Cicero's friends in all of these other schools of philosophy would not raise a finger to do anything about it. It was Epicurus and his followers, and it was because they had grasped some semblance of the most important truth that there is. And that truth is that the wild, grotesque, supernatural claims that are made by these other people are lies, that predicating yourself on this cloak of virtue to hide all of your sins and so forth, that is a lie, and that truth is better than any make-believe. So that's kind of my year-end conclusion here, That is my response to almost everything that Cicero has to say. And that's something that I'm going to be thinking about as we go forward into the next, I think, 25 pages of this book we've got left.
That's a great way to summarize the situation, Joshua. In contrast to Cicero saying that it's impossible to be a good man unless you consider that virtue is the basis of the supreme good, the fact of the matter is that even in Cicero's own world, his best friend was an Epicurean. Cassius, who he was ultimately relying on against Julius Caesar, was an Epicurean. Torquatus, who he's talking to, is an Epicurean, and yet his goodness as a person is beyond dispute. We frequently overlook the foundations and we think about, well, Epicurus talks about being happy. I want to live happily, so therefore I'm going to just listen to what Epicurus has to say about the subject of happiness because I've chosen that as my goal in life. But Epicurus is not suggesting that you start that way, as Epicurus himself did when he was a young person and challenged his teachers as to chaos and where the universe comes from. It is super important to focus on the issue of what is true versus what is false, and use the truth as the basis for your life, because you do only get one life to live. You have to live it as productively as you can, and you don't know what is the most productive way to live unless you first pursue the truth about the nature of the universe. That's what Epicurus continuously calls us to do, and that's what we'll get back to in 2024 as we come back next year in our next episode. We invite everyone, as we always do, to drop by the forum and let us know your thoughts about the podcast and the forum in general. Thank you for your time this week. We'll be back soon. Bye.